Welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in to today's Explainer. Today, we're basically putting on our scrubs and acting as political diagnosticians. We're going to unpack the roots of modern authoritarian populism and really examine the structural health of our democracies. Because across the globe right now, from the US to Europe, we are seeing these massive, seismic shifts in how politics operates. We're seeing the rise of leaders and movements that frankly challenge the very foundations of the liberal democratic order. So, we're going to break down the symptoms, the historical echoes, and the paradoxes of these movements, all strictly through the lens of recent political science, constitutional theory, and historical analysis. Here's our clinical agenda for today. We'll start with the roots of modern populism, look at echoes of historical fascism, explore the neoliberal paradox, tackle the militant democracy dilemma, and finish up with pathways to democratic renewal. Let's just dive right in.
Okay, part 1. The roots of modern populism. Let's look at the symptoms.
To make sense of our current era, we really need to define what's driving this global movement. We hear the word populist thrown around constantly, right? But what does it actually mean in a modern context? Well, the crucial point here is that this specific brand, what experts call exclusionary populism, claims a total monopoly on who the real people are. It frames politics as this epic moral struggle between the pure people and a corrupt elite. But, and this is key, it weaponizes that identity against marginalized outgroups like migrants or religious minorities, framing them as an existential threat to the dominant nation. And this isn't just some clever political strategy. Human rights scholars note that it actively threatens the basic rights of those excluded, which obviously produces severe, real-world consequences for society.
Now, this is where things get really fascinating, because recent research completely debunks a very common myth. For years, the popular narrative was that right-wing populism was purely driven by economic anxiety. Factory closures, job losses, the long-term fallout of the 2008 financial crisis. But when researchers look at the data across multiple advanced democracies, Denmark, France, Germany, the UK, they found that people facing severe economic insecurity actually represent only a limited share of populist voters. So that completely forces us to look beyond just the wallet and examine cultural and psychological factors instead.
So if it isn't just economics, what is it? Well, it turns out cultural grievances are the primary fuel for this political fire. Political psychologists point to something called collective narcissism, which is basically this intense belief that your specific group is exceptional but is somehow being ignored or disrespected by the rest of society. They also point to ethnocentrism. A lot of voters feel a perceived threat to their cultural status because of rapid societal changes, and that generates a really powerful sense of humiliation, which these political movements answer with a demand for retribution and a promise to restore a perceived lost greatness.
Moving on to part 2, echoes of historical fascism, or the historical pathology. We have to objectively address the elephant in the room, the frequent comparisons historians and political scientists draw between contemporary populist leaders and historical authoritarians. The debate usually gets totally stuck on whether today's leaders are literal fascists. Skeptics rightly point out that interwar European fascism in the 1920s and 30s relied on massive state corporatism, highly regulated economies, and deployed party armies, literally paramilitaries marching in the streets. Modern authoritarian populism is very different. It generally operates within electoral strategies. It often embraces free market neoliberal economics and relies on rhetorical violence and a slow erosion of the rule of law, rather than, say, outright military coups.
So, to make sense of the overlaps without getting completely bogged down in whether the historical conditions are absolutely identical, political scholars use this really helpful concept called a portable definition. This allows us to identify alarming family resemblances in modern movements, focusing on the core ideological engine rather than demanding every single historical detail matches up perfectly.
And this brings us to the core overlap scholars point to: palingenetic ultranationalism. I know, it's a total mouthful, but it's actually just a complex term for a very simple, incredibly seductive promise: national rebirth. It's the vision of a country rising phoenix-like from the ashes of humiliation and decadence. This narrative, that a fallen nation can only be saved by a strong, charismatic leader who will basically cleanse it of internal and external enemies, is a theme utterly central to both historical fascism and modern exclusionary populism. It is the psychological bridge between the 1930s and today.
All right, part 3, the neoliberal paradox. This is where we look at a major comorbidity.
We run into a wild contradiction here in the anatomy of modern right-wing movements. Leaders often merge two seemingly opposite forces. On one side, you have neoliberal economics,
slashing regulations, championing hyper-individualism, cutting taxes for the wealthy, dismantling the welfare state. But on the other side, you have authoritarian social policy, hyper-nationalism, incredibly strict border controls, and strongman leadership that demands collective loyalty. It's this strange blend of anti-statist, dog-eat-dog economic individualism paired with a really heavy-handed, authoritarian approach to social and cultural life.
And the ultimate irony here, the real paradox, is that these leaders often double down on the very free market policies that created the disenfranchisement their supporters are rebelling against in the first place. By dismantling social protections, they actually perpetuate the precarity and anxiety of the working class. But they are incredibly successful at redirecting that resulting anger away from the economic system itself and pointing it instead toward immigrants, minorities, and the political left.
Which brings us to part 4, the militant democracy dilemma. We're going to look at the treatment plan and its potentially dangerous side effects.
Because liberal institutions have attempted to apply a legal cure. But we have to ask a really critical question that strikes at the heart of our modern systems. When faced with politicians who use democratic means to potentially undermine democracy, can a system successfully ban its way to safety?
We are seeing widespread implementation of a concept called militant democracy. Basically, this is a constitutional doctrine where the state tries to protect itself by legally excluding or even putting on trial candidates or parties that are deemed anti-constitutional. We've seen this with the U.S. Supreme Court reviewing attempts to remove Donald Trump from the ballot using the 14th Amendment. In Germany, there are incredibly serious political debates right now about outright banning the far-right AfD party. And in Romania, courts recently barred a controversial presidential candidate from running altogether.
But here's where the treatment actually feeds the disease. For decades, liberal elites have relied heavily on technocratic governance, moving critical economic and political decisions away from elected parliaments and putting them into the hands of central banks, regulatory bodies, and unelected judges. The goal, of course, was efficiency and stability. But when we contrast that technocratic policy with populist reality, we see that insulating decisions from the public absolutely validates the populist claim. It makes ordinary voters feel completely powerless and alienated, essentially proving the populist point that the system is run by distant, unresponsible elites.
Ultimately, legal scholars are warning us that using the courts to ban representatives who hold the legitimate support of millions of voters creates a massive, dangerous, slippery slope. It restricts freedoms, it limits political participation, and in the name of self-preservation, this impulse to ban adversaries risks actually turning a democracy authoritarian. It confirms every single conspiracy theory the populists preach, and it unintentionally pours gasoline on the very movements it's trying to destroy.
Finally, Part 5, Pathways to Democratic Renewal. If we can't ban our way out of this, what is the actual cure?
Well, the true cure requires systemic renewal, and scholars point to a few key steps. First, democratic actors have got to break the comfortable habit of trying to eliminate competitors through the courts. Second, they have to step up and offer genuine political visions that actually address those root structural grievances, the economic precarity, the loss of community, that intense feeling of abandonment. And third, and research into political polarization strongly backs this up, we need to facilitate localized dialogue. Getting citizens into neutral spaces with trained mediators allows people to air their grievances and discover common ground, completely away from the toxic, hyperpolarized filter of national partisan warfare. I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. Defending democracy means we actually have to expand participation, not restrict it. We have to treat the root rot in our systems. Blaming the voters or just trying to ban their chosen candidates is the easy way out, and frankly, it's failing. The real question is, are our institutions brave enough to undergo genuine self-reflection and systemic reform? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions, and I'll see you next time.